The auction block stood weathered and worn in the center of Millbrook's town square, its wooden planks stained dark from years of rain and regret. On this particular Tuesday morning in 1887, the autumn air carried more than just the scent of dying leaves. It carried the weight of desperation and the echo of broken dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Sinclair sat in her wheeled chair at the edge of the crowd, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her spine straight despite everything that had brought her to this moment. The chair itself was a crude thing, fashioned from oak and iron by her late father's rough hands 3 years prior, when the fever had taken the use of her legs and left her dependent on the charity of relatives who had grown tired of her burden. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, hawking furniture and livestock with equal enthusiasm. But Margaret knew what came next. She had heard the whispers, seen the pointed glances, felt the weight of being discussed like property rather than person. Her uncle Cornelius stood nearby, mopping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning, his wife Prudence clutching a handkerchief, as if it might shield her from the shame of what they were about to do. "Lot 47, the auctioneer called, and Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. One woman, aged 24, skilled in domestic arts, reading and arithmetic, comes with chair and personal effects. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away entirely. Others leaned forward with the kind of curiosity reserved for spectacles and tragedies. Margaret lifted her chin higher, her green eyes scanning the faces before her. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break, not here, not now, not when she had already endured so much. From the back of the crowd, a figure emerged. Thomas Brennan moved with the deliberate slowness of a man carrying invisible weight, his broad shoulders slightly hunched as if the world pressed down upon them with particular cruelty. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots scuffed from honest work, and his face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunrises while nursing too many sorrows. He had not come to town intending to buy anything, let alone anyone. The trip to Millbrook had been born of necessity, supplies for his failing ranch, perhaps a word with the bank about extending his loan, maybe a bottle of whiskey to help him sleep through another night haunted by memories of Caroline's laughter, echoing through empty rooms. But when he saw Margaret Sinclair sitting there with her back ramrod straight and her eyes blazing with defiant dignity, something stirred in his chest that he had thought dead and buried alongside his wife 2 winters past. The bidding started low, shamefully low. A farmer from the East County offered $50, the amount one might pay for a decent horse or a month's worth of grain. Margaret's uncle nodded eagerly, desperate to be rid of his burden. But Thomas found himself raising his hand. 100, his voice carried across the square, rough from disuse and surprise at his own actions. Heads turned. The farmer scowled and countered with 120. Thomas felt something hot and protective rise in his throat. This was wrong, all of it. But if it was happening regardless, then by God, it would not be to some man who looked at Margaret like she was damaged goods. 200, Thomas called, and the firmness in his voice silenced the murmurs. The auctioneer looked around hopefully, but no other bids came. $200 was more than most men in Millbrook saw in 6 months. The farmer shook his head and melted back into the crowd. Uncle Cornelius was practically bouncing on his toes with relief. "Agreed. Sold to Mr. Brennan," the auctioneer announced, and just like that, Margaret's fate was sealed. She looked at him then, really looked, and Thomas felt the full weight of what he had done. This was not like buying cattle or horses. This was a human being, a woman whose life he had just purchased for the price of a good bull. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it steadied something inside him that had been shaking for 2 long years. He approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, not from fear, but from respect for pain. When he reached her chair, he removed his hat and crouched down so they were eye to eye. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm Thomas Brennan. I own a ranch about 15 miles northeast of here. I want you to know that whatever arrangement this is, it's not what it looks like." Margaret studied his face, searching for deception or cruelty, and finding neither. His eyes were brown, she noticed, the color of rich earth after rain, and they held a sadness that matched her own. "What does it look like, Mr. Brennan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Like I bought you," he said simply. "Like your property. You're not. You're a person who deserves better than this, and if you'll come with me, I'll try to give you that." Before she could respond, Uncle Cornelius bustled over, his face flushed with relief, and something that might have been shame if he had possessed more conscience. "Now, Margaret, you be good to Mr. Brennan here. He's paid a fair price, more than fair, and you remember your place. Don't go causing trouble or putting on airs." Thomas stood slowly, his jaw tightening. "Mr. Sinclair, I believe our business is concluded. The lady and I will be leaving now." Something in his tone made Cornelius step back. Thomas moved behind Margaret's chair without asking permission, his hands gripping the handles with careful respect. "Where are your things?" he asked her. "In the wagon by the mercantile," she replied. "One trunk and a few books." As Thomas pushed her chair across the uneven dirt of the town square, Margaret found herself holding her breath. The crowd parted before them, some staring openly, others pretending interest in their boots or the sky. She heard whispers following in their wake, speculation about the strange rancher who had paid so much for a crippled woman, wonder about what he intended to do with her. At the wagon, Thomas lifted her trunk with ease, his muscles flexing beneath his worn shirt. Margaret watched him secure her belongings, alongside what appeared to be basic supplies, flour, coffee, a few tools. His movements were efficient, practiced, the actions of a man accustomed to hard work and careful planning. "The books, too," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. "Books?" "In the small crate. I know they're not practical, but—" "Books are always practical," Thomas said firmly, lifting the crate with the same care he had shown her trunk. "A mind needs feeding just like a body." Something loosened in Margaret's chest at those words. When was the last time someone had spoken to her about her mind rather than her limitations? Thomas's own wagon was well maintained but simple, the kind built for function rather than comfort. He had lined the bed with blankets and hay, clearly having given some thought to the journey ahead. When he approached her chair, he paused. "I can lift you if that's acceptable," he said, "or we can figure out another way." The directness of his offer, free from pity or awkwardness, surprised her. "That would be acceptable," she replied. His hands were gentle but sure as he lifted her from the chair, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. For a moment, suspended between earth and wagon, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. Not because of his strength, but because of his matter-of-fact kindness. He settled her carefully onto the blankets, then folded her chair and secured it to the wagon's side. As they prepared to leave Millbrook behind, Margaret realized she was not looking back. Whatever lay ahead on Thomas Brennan's ranch, it had to be better than what she was leaving. The journey northeast took them through rolling hills, dressed in autumn's finest colors. Maples blazed red and gold, oaks held onto their bronze leaves with stubborn dignity, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Thomas kept the horses to a steady pace, mindful of the rough roads and his passengers' comfort. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Margaret spoke. "You didn't answer my question back. Out there, What does this arrangement look like to you?" Thomas was quiet for so long, she wondered if he had heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful, like a chance for both of us to find something we lost, he said. "I lost my wife 2 years ago, cholera, lost our unborn child with her. Since then, I've been dying by degrees, going through the motions of living without any of the substance." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry." "And you lost your legs," he continued, not acknowledging her sympathy. "But more than that, you lost your place in the world. People stopped seeing you as a whole person. You became a burden, a problem to be solved or discarded." The accuracy of his assessment took her breath away. "How do you know?" "Because I've been watching people look through me for 2 years, like I'm a ghost haunting my own life. Different reasons, same result. We're both inconvenient to the world as it stands." They crested a hill, and the Brennan Ranch spread out below them. It was larger than Margaret had expected, with a sturdy 2-story house painted white with green shutters, a substantial barn, and several outbuildings. Cattle dotted the pastures, and smoke rose from the chimney into the clear autumn sky. It looked like the kind of place where a family might grow and prosper, though the absence of human activity gave it a lonely quality. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and meant it. "Caroline designed the garden," Thomas said quietly. "I haven't touched it since she died. Probably should have, but I couldn't bring myself to change anything she had put her hands to." As they drew closer, Margaret could see the garden he spoke of. What had once been carefully tended rows now grew wild, flowers and vegetables mixing in beautiful chaos. Roses climbed untamed over a trellis, morning glories wound through the fence posts, and pumpkins sprawled across what had probably been herb beds. "She had good instincts," Margaret observed. "Look how the roses have found their own way up that oak tree, and the way the sunflowers are following the light. She must have planned for that." Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and turned to look at her, something like wonder in his expression. "You see that? The planning behind the chaos?" "My father was a gardener," Margaret explained. "Before the war, before everything changed. He taught me that plants know what they need if you give them the foundation. Your wife gave them a good foundation." For the first time since she had met him, Thomas smiled. It was a small thing, tentative and rusty from disuse, but it transformed his entire face. "Come on," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "Let me show you the house." The process of getting Margaret inside required some problem-solving. The front steps were too narrow for her chair, but Thomas had clearly been thinking about this during the ride. He carried her up to the porch first, then brought her chair up separately, approaching the logistics like any other ranch challenge that needed solving. The house's interior was clean but sparse, with the feel of a place where someone had stopped, really living. The furniture was good quality, but arranged without thought for comfort or beauty. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that looked like they hadn't been opened in months. "The kitchen's through there," Thomas said, gesturing toward the back of the house. "Parlor's to your left, 3 bedrooms upstairs, though I've only been using one since." He trailed off. "Where would you like me to sleep?" Margaret asked practically. "There's a room on this floor, behind the kitchen. Used to be Carolyn's sewing room. It's small, but it might work better for you. Less stairs to navigate." His consideration touched her in a way she hadn't expected. "That sounds perfect." They spent the rest of the afternoon in a careful dance of assessment and arrangement. Thomas brought her trunk to the small room and helped her think through how to make it functional. He moved furniture without being asked, adjusted the height of surfaces without making a production of it, and listened when she suggested changes. As evening approached, Margaret found herself in the kitchen, looking through Thomas's sparse pantry while he tended to the animals. She had insisted on contributing to their supper, partly from pride and partly from a need to feel useful. The kitchen was well equipped but clearly underused. Too many meals of bread and beans, too little care for the pleasure of cooking. Thomas returned as she was pulling biscuits from the oven, the smell of fresh bread and bacon filling the kitchen. With warmth, he stopped in the doorway and she saw something raw and vulnerable cross his features. "Haven't smelled that in 2 years," he said quietly. They ate in the kitchen as darkness fell outside, the meal punctuated by comfortable silence and hesitant conversation. Thomas asked about her books, her life before the fever, her dreams that had been deferred but not destroyed. Margaret found herself talking more than she had in months, his genuine interest drawing out thoughts and feelings she had kept carefully buried. "What will people say?" she asked finally, voicing the question that had been hovering between them all day. "About this arrangement." Thomas considered this, chewing thoughtfully. "They'll say plenty, I expect. None of it kind, most of it wrong. Does that worry you?" "I've been worried about what people say my entire life," Margaret replied. "It never stopped them from saying it. Maybe it's time to worry about something else." "Like what?" She looked around the kitchen at the home he had, shared with his lost wife, at the man who had paid $200 to give a stranger dignity instead of despair. "Like whether I can learn to make you smile more than once a day," she said. This time, his smile came easier, and Margaret felt something take root in her chest that she had thought lost forever. Hope. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of spring beyond. Inside the house, 2 broken people began the delicate work of discovering that wholeness might be possible after all, even when it came in unexpected forms. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, the silence felt like peace rather than emptiness. Dawn crept across the prairie like spilled honey, golden and slow, painting the bedroom walls where Margaret lay listening to unfamiliar sounds. The house creaked differently than Uncle Cornelius's cramped quarters above the dry goods store. Here, the settling wood spoke of permanence rather than temporary shelter, of rooms built for living rather than mere survival. Through the thin walls, she heard Thomas moving about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, the soft thud of boots on floorboards, the gentle clank of the coffee pot, the whisper of kindling catching flame. He moved quietly, considerately, the way someone does when they're accustomed to not disturbing others, even when those others no longer existed to be disturbed. Margaret maneuvered herself into her chair with the fluid motion of 3 years. Practice, though the unfamiliarity of the room made her more cautious than usual. She had learned to navigate new spaces like a scout in enemy territory, cataloguing obstacles and calculating routes before committing to movement. The sewing room Thomas had offered her was compact but thoughtfully arranged, with wide doorways and clear pathways that spoke to Caroline Brennan's practical mind. In the kitchen, she found Thomas standing at the window with his coffee, watching the sunrise paint his cattle orange and gold. He turned when he heard her wheels on the floorboards, and she caught something vulnerable in his expression before he could compose it. "Morning," he said simply, moving to pour her coffee without asking if she wanted it. The assumption might have rankled from someone else, but his manner was courteous rather than presumptuous, offering rather than imposing. "Thank you." Margaret accepted the cup, warming her hands around the chipped ceramic. "You're up early." "Stock doesn't tend itself," Thomas replied, then paused. "Though I suppose you know that. Your father raised cattle before the war." "Horses mostly, some sheep." Margaret sipped the coffee, surprised by its quality. She had expected the bitter brew of a bachelor's kitchen, but this was smooth and rich. He believed in starting early and finishing strong. Thomas nodded, understanding passing between them like shared sunlight. "Smart man. I've got rounds to make this morning, checking fences, counting heads, making sure the water's running clear. You're welcome to come along if you'd like, or stay here and settle in more, whatever suits you. The offer surprised her. Most people would have assumed the rough terrain of a working ranch was beyond someone in her condition. That Thomas extended the invitation as naturally as he might to any guest spoke to something in his character that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'd like to come," she said, "if you think the wagon can manage it." "The wagon can manage anything this ranch can throw at it," Thomas said, with the first hint of pride she had heard in his voice. "Built it myself 3 years back when Caroline was carrying—" He stopped abruptly, the sentence hanging unfinished between them. Margaret didn't press. She understood the weight of unfinished sentences, the way grief could turn ordinary words into treacherous ground. 20 minutes later, they were rolling across Thomas's land in the sturdy wagon, Margaret's chair secured behind them and a picnic lunch packed beneath the seat. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dried grass, underlaid with the richer smell of earth preparing for winter's sleep. The ranch stretched farther than Margaret had realized the day before. Rolling hills dotted with cattle gave way to bottomland, where a creek meandered between cottonwoods and willows. Thomas drove with the easy competence of someone who knew every rock and rut, pointing out landmarks and explaining his operation with growing animation. "That pasture there was the first one I cleared," he said, gesturing toward a fenced area where young steers grazed peacefully. "Took me 6 months of evenings, pulling stumps and hauling rocks. Caroline used to bring me supper out here when the work ran late." "She must have been patient," Margaret observed, "patient enough to marry a man who talked more about soil composition than poetry." Thomas replied with a self-deprecating smile. "Though she claimed that was part of my charm. Said most men promised her the moon, but I was the only one who could deliver good grass and clean water." They stopped at a natural spring where Thomas checked the flow and temperature, his movements methodical and practiced. Margaret watched him work, noting the careful way he examined everything, the respectful manner in which he handled even the simplest tools. This was a man who understood that success came from attention to detail, from caring for the small things that made larger things possible. "The water's running lower than I'd like," he admitted, straightening with a frown. "Normal for this time of year, but still concerning. Winter snow will help, but if we have a dry spring—" "Have you considered redirecting the flow?" Margaret asked, studying the terrain around the spring. "Creating a small reservoir to capture more of the runoff?" Thomas followed her gaze, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine attention. "You have experience with water management." "My father dealt with drought years. He learned to think like water, where it wanted to go, how to encourage it to stay." Margaret pointed to a natural depression about 50 yards from the spring. "If you built a small earthen dam there, lined it with clay, you could catch the overflow during heavy rains and have reserves for dry spells. That's—" Thomas studied the landscape with new eyes, seeing possibilities he had missed. "That's brilliant. Simple but brilliant. Why didn't I think of that?" "Sometimes we're too close to our problems to see the solutions," Margaret said gently. "Fresh eyes help." They spent the next hour walking, Thomas on foot, Margaret in her chair, around the water source, discussing possibilities and practicalities. Margaret found herself energized by the conversation in a way she hadn't felt since before her illness. Thomas listened to her ideas with genuine respect, asking thoughtful questions and building on her suggestions rather than dismissing them. When they returned to the wagon for lunch, the sun was high and warm despite the autumn air. Thomas had packed simple fare, bread, cheese, apples from his own trees, but eaten in the midst of his thriving ranch with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and hawks circling overhead. It felt like a feast. "Tell me about your books," Thomas said as they ate, his tone carefully casual. Margaret looked up, surprised. "What about them? What do you read? What do you think about when you're reading?" Caroline loved books, but she never talked much about what they meant to her. I always wondered. The question opened something in Margaret that had been carefully sealed for months. Her relatives had tolerated her reading as an acceptable way to pass time, but no one had ever asked her about the contents of her mind. "Everything," she said, then laughed at her own enthusiasm. "Poetry, philosophy, novels, agricultural journals when I can find them. Scientific papers about medicine and engineering. I suppose I read to understand how things work. People, systems, ideas. And what have you learned?" Margaret considered this, absently watching a red-winged blackbird build its nest in a nearby cattail. "Most problems have solutions, but the solutions usually require seeing things differently than we're used to. That people are more alike than different, regardless of their circumstances. That knowledge is only valuable if you can apply it to making life better." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "What did you expect?" "Someone broken, someone who needed saving." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You don't need saving, do you? You need an opportunity." The distinction hit Margaret like a physical blow, so accurate it took her breath away. No one's ever understood that before. Then no one's been paying attention. They finished lunch in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts too new and fragile to voice. As they prepared to continue their tour of the ranch, Margaret felt something shifting inside her, not healing exactly because she hadn't been broken in the way people assumed, but recognition. For the first time in 3 years, she felt seen. The afternoon took them to the farthest corners of Thomas's property, where the land rose into rocky hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. Here, the cattle were rangier, more independent, and the work of checking on them required careful navigation of steep terrain. "I usually do this part on horseback," Thomas admitted as they approached a particularly challenging slope. "The wagon might not make it." "Then we walk," Margaret said, simply. Thomas turned to look at her, clearly torn between courtesy and practicality. "The ground's pretty rough. Your chair might not—" "Mr. Brennan," Margaret interrupted gently, "I've been navigating rough ground for 3 years. I know what I can and can't do. The question is whether you're comfortable with me attempting." Something in her tone made him reconsider his automatic protectiveness. "All right," he said slowly. "But if it gets too difficult—" "I'll tell you," Margaret promised. The terrain was indeed challenging, but Margaret had learned to read ground the way a sailor reads water, identifying the smoothest paths and using momentum to carry her through difficult spots. Thomas stayed. Close but didn't hover, offering assistance when asked, but otherwise letting her navigate independently. They found the cattle healthy and well distributed across the range, though Thomas noted several places where fencing needed repair before winter. As they worked their way back toward easier ground, Margaret asked about his plans for expansion. "Used to think about it," Thomas said, pausing to examine a broken fence post. "Caroline and I talked about increasing the herd, maybe adding some sheep for wool production, building up enough capital to modernize the house, add some amenities." He shrugged. After she died, it seemed pointless. What was the purpose of building something I'd experience alone? "And now?" Thomas glanced at her, then away toward his grazing cattle. "Now I'm not sure. Having someone to talk through ideas with again, it changes how you think about the future." The comment hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Instead, they focused on the immediate work at hand, cataloging repairs needed and planning the best use of resources. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they made their way back to the house through pastures where Thomas's cattle moved in lazy contentment toward water and shelter. The day's warmth was giving way to the crisp promise of autumn night, and smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys in the distant settlement. "I enjoyed today," Margaret said, as Thomas helped her from the wagon. "Thank you for including me." "Thank you for the water management ideas," Thomas replied, "and for—" he paused, clearly struggling with words, "for seeing possibilities instead of problems." That evening, as Margaret prepared a more elaborate supper than Thomas had enjoyed in months, she reflected on the day's revelations. She had expected to be a burden, a charity case endured out of duty. Instead, she had found herself valued as a thinking partner, someone whose ideas and perspectives were not only welcome, but actively sought. The kitchen filled with the smell of roasting chicken and fresh bread, scents that seemed to bring the house itself back to life. Thomas appeared in the doorway as she was setting the table, his hair damp from washing, his face bearing an expression she was beginning to recognize, surprise at finding himself pleased by domestic comfort. "Smells like a home should," he said, quietly. "Feels like one too," Margaret replied, and meant it. Over dinner, they talked about practical matters, the water management project, fencing repairs, preparations for winter. But underneath the practical conversation ran a deeper current of understanding, a recognition that they were building something together, even if neither was quite ready to name what that something might be. As night settled over the ranch and the fire crackled in the hearth, Margaret found herself thinking about possibility, not the abstract kind found in books, but the real, tangible kind that existed between two people discovering they could create something better together than either could manage alone. Outside, the prairie wind sang through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of frost. Inside, the house that had been silent too long was learning to breathe again, filled with voices and purpose, and the careful hope of two souls learning to trust in tomorrow. The first snow arrived 3 weeks later, not the gentle dusting that whispered of winter's approach, but a serious storm that blanketed the ranch in 8 inches of pristine white and trapped them indoors for 2 days. Margaret woke to a world transformed, where familiar landmarks had become softened sculptures and the cattle stood like dark sentinels against the pale landscape. Thomas was already up, stoking the fire and preparing for the extra work that snow always brought. Through the kitchen window, Margaret watched him trudge through drifts to check on the animals, his broad shoulders bent against the wind that drove sharp crystals of ice horizontal across the yard. Thomas shrugged, the gesture of a man accustomed to necessary risks. "Cattle don't care about dangerous. They just need food and shelter to survive." Margaret wheeled herself to the window, studying the storm with the analytical mind that had impressed Thomas during their ranch tours. The wind patterns were visible in the way the snow accumulated, heavier drifts against the barn and outbuildings, lighter coverage in the lee of the hills where natural windbreaks offered protection. "What if we don't fight the storm?" she asked. Suddenly, "Come again. Instead of forcing our way through the drifts, what if we use them, create a funnel that guides the cattle where we want them to go?" Margaret traced patterns on the frosted glass. Snow follows predictable patterns based on wind direction and obstacles. If we place barriers strategically, we could redirect the drifts to create natural pathways. Thomas moved to stand beside her, following her reasoning as she pointed out. "Wind patterns and terrain features? You're thinking like an engineer again." "I'm thinking like someone who doesn't want you frozen to death trying to save 20 cows. Margaret replied, with more heat than she had intended. The sharpness in her voice surprised them both. Thomas turned to look at her fully, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized what she had revealed, that his safety mattered to her in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. "I mean," she continued more carefully, "there has to be a smarter way than brute force." "Show me," Thomas said simply. They spent the morning at the kitchen table with pencil and paper, mapping out the ranch's topography and plotting wind patterns based on years of Thomas's observations. Margaret's engineering mind translated his practical knowledge into systematic analysis, while his intimate familiarity with the land grounded her theoretical understanding in reality. "If we place hay bales here and here," Margaret said, sketching quickly, "the wind will push snow around them instead of over them, creating clear corridors between the drifts. The cattle will naturally follow the easiest path, which will lead them straight to the shelter." Thomas studied her drawings, his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding, to something approaching awe. That could actually work. Why didn't I think of something like this before? "Because you've been thinking like a rancher, not like Snow," Margaret replied, "and because solutions sometimes come from seeing familiar problems with unfamiliar eyes." By afternoon, the storm had intensified enough that even venturing to the barn required ropes strung between buildings. But Thomas's preparations, guided by Margaret's strategic thinking, proved their worth. Through the swirling white, they could see the cattle moving along the channels Margaret had predicted, finding their way to shelter with minimal human intervention. "Remarkable," Thomas muttered, watching from the kitchen window as the last stragglers followed the snow-carved pathways to safety. "Absolutely remarkable." That evening, with the storm howling outside and the house warm with firelight and cooking smells, they settled into a comfortable routine that was becoming natural. Margaret had taken over most of the cooking, finding satisfaction in creating meals that brought genuine pleasure to Thomas's features. He, in turn, had begun sharing more of his thoughts and plans, treating her as a full partner in ranch operations rather than a guest. "I've been thinking about your water management ideas," Thomas said, as they finished a dinner of beef stew and cornbread. "Not just for this spring, but as part of a larger system. What if we could design something that worked year-round?" Margaret leaned forward, interested. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, you mentioned using natural depressions to catch runoff. But what if we created a network of small reservoirs, connected by channels, something that could capture snow melt in the spring, store it through the summer, and provide backup water during dry spells?" The idea sparked Margaret's imagination immediately. "We could use gravity flow to move water between reservoirs, minimize the need for pumping, and if we designed the channels properly, they could also serve as fire breaks during dry seasons." Fire breaks? Cleared. Corridors with standing water, too wet to burn easily. They could help protect the ranch if prairie fires are ever threatened. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "You see connections I never would have imagined. It's like you think in 3 dimensions, while the rest of us are stuck thinking flat." "I think differently because I have to," Margaret said quietly. "When you can't move through the world the way everyone else does, you learn to think around obstacles instead of through them. It changes how you approach problems." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You think differently because you're brilliant. The wheelchair doesn't create intelligence, Margaret. It just forces the world to pay attention to intelligence it might otherwise ignore." The conviction in his voice, the use of her given name for the first time, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious and rare, all of it combined to steal her breath and send warmth flooding through her chest. "Thomas," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the feelings growing inside her. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too." The storm raged for 2 more days, but inside the house, something else entirely was building. They worked together on ranch planning, Margaret's theoretical knowledge combining with Thomas's practical experience to create possibilities neither could have envisioned alone. They read aloud in the evenings, taking turns with books from Margaret's collection and discovering shared appreciation for poetry and philosophy alongside agricultural journals. Most importantly, they talked about Caroline and the grief that had nearly destroyed Thomas, about Margaret's life before the fever and the dreams she had been forced to abandon. About the future and what two people might build together if they were brave enough to trust in possibility. "I loved Caroline," Thomas said one evening as they sat by the fire, the storm finally beginning to subside outside. "Loved her completely. Absolutely. When she died, I thought that was it. My one chance at happiness, gone forever." Margaret nodded, understanding the courage it took to speak of such things. "But this," Thomas continued, gesturing between them, "what's growing between us, it's not the same as what Caroline and I had. It's something entirely different, something I never expected to find." "What makes it different?" Margaret asked. Softly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Caroline loved me, despite my flaws, in spite of my rough edges and stubborn ways. She saw past them to something she valued underneath." He turned to look at Margaret directly. "You love my flaws. You see how they fit with your own, to create something stronger than either of us could be alone." The word love hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross until now. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of possibility and fear in equal measure. "Thomas," she whispered, "I know we haven't known each other long," he continued quickly, as if afraid she might stop him. "I know this arrangement started as something else entirely. But Margaret, what I feel for you, it's not gratitude or pity or convenience. It's love. Real, true, complicated love for the woman you are, not the woman I thought I was rescuing." Marguerite felt tears sliding down her cheeks, tears she couldn't have explained even to herself. Relief, joy, fear, hope, all of it tangled together in a knot too complex to unravel. "I love you too," she said, the words coming out rough and unsteady. "I love your kindness and your strength and the way you listen to ideas without immediately explaining why they won't work. I love that you see me as a partner instead of a problem to be solved." Thomas crossed the small space between their chairs and knelt beside her, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "Then marry me," he said simply. "Not because you owe me anything, not because it's convenient or practical, but because we're better together than apart, because we love each other and want to build something lasting." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for any trace of duty or obligation, and finding none. What she saw instead was a man who had discovered that love could come in unexpected forms, who had learned that healing sometimes meant embracing change rather than trying to recreate the past. "Yes," she said, and then louder with more confidence, "Yes, Thomas, yes, I'll marry you." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of someone who understood the preciousness of second chances, the miracle of finding love in the most unlikely circumstances. Outside, the storm was finally breaking, moonlight beginning to filter through the clouds to illuminate a world made new by snow. Inside, two hearts that had learned to live with loss discovered they could also learn to live with love. Not the desperate, clinging love of people afraid of being alone, but the steady, building love of partners who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were offering and what they were accepting in return. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun turning the snow-covered ranch into a landscape of diamonds and crystal. Margaret woke to find Thomas already up, but instead of the usual sounds of morning chores, she heard him moving about the house with unusual purpose. When she wheeled into the kitchen, she found him at the table with paper and ink, writing carefully, in his best hand. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Letter to the preacher in Millbrook," Thomas replied without looking up. "Asking him to post the banns and arrange for a wedding ceremony. Figured we might as well make this official and proper." "So soon?" Thomas set down his pen and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I'm 34 years old. I've been married before, buried a wife, and learned that life is too uncertain to waste time on lengthy courtships when you've found the person you want to spend your remaining years with. If you need more time, to be sure." "I don't," Margaret interrupted, I was just surprised by your certainty. My certainty comes from watching you think, listening to you solve problems, seeing how you approach challenges with intelligence instead of complaint. It comes from 3 weeks of discovering that every day with you is better than the day before. Thomas reached for her hands. I don't need more time to know you're the person I want beside me for whatever years I have left. As they worked together, that morning to dig out from the storm, using Margaret's strategic approach to clearing pathways rather than simply shoveling everything, Margaret marveled at the transformation in both their lives. 3 weeks ago, she had been property sold at auction, a burden her own family couldn't wait to discard. Now she was a partner, a planner, a woman loved for her mind and heart rather than tolerated despite her limitations. The cattle emerged from their shelters, healthy and well-fed. The water systems continued flowing despite the freeze, and the ranch operations resumed with minimal disruption, all testament to the power of thinking strategically rather than simply reacting to circumstances. We make a good team, Thomas observed as they surveyed their domain from the warmth of the kitchen, watching the cattle resume their normal routines in the snow-covered pastures. We do, Margaret agreed, leaning into his shoulder as he stood beside her chair, in ways I never expected to experience. That afternoon, Thomas hitched up the wagon for the trip to town, the first time either of them had left the ranch since the storm began. Margaret insisted on coming along, partly to select fabric for a wedding dress, but mostly because she was ready to face Millbrook as Thomas Brennan's chosen bride, rather than the desperate woman who had been sold from the auction block. The transformation in how people looked at her was immediate and profound. Word had already spread about the strange rancher who had paid so much for the crippled woman, but seeing them together, Thomas's obvious pride in her company, Margaret's confident bearing, the way they consulted each other on decisions, challenged every assumption the town had made about their arrangement. "Miss Sinclair," the dressmaker said carefully. "I mean Mrs. That is, what should I call you?" "Miss Sinclair for now," Margaret replied smoothly, "though that will be changing soon. I'm here to commission a wedding dress." The woman's eyes widened, darting between Margaret and Thomas. "A wedding dress?" "Nothing elaborate," Margaret continued, as if commissioning wedding attire were the most natural thing in the world. "Something practical and beautiful, in a color that suits the season. Mr. Brennan and I will be married as soon as the banns can be properly posted." As word spread through the shop and into the street beyond, Margaret felt the weight of attention and speculation. But instead of the shame and desperation that had marked her last visit to Millbrook, she now felt the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her own worth and had found someone who recognized it as well. Standing beside Thomas as they conducted their business, planning their future with the same careful consideration they brought to ranch management, Margaret realized she had discovered something she hadn't even known she was seeking. Not rescue, not charity, not even simple acceptance, but true partnership, with someone who valued her exactly as she was, while helping her become more than she had ever imagined possible. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by young Billy Fletcher, who rode dispatch for the county. Margaret recognized the handwriting before Thomas had even broken the wax seal. Uncle Cornelius's cramped script, always pressed deep into the paper, as if the words themselves might escape if not firmly anchored to the page. Thomas read in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and set it aside, but not before Margaret caught sight of legal terminology and official stamps. "What does he want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Claims you're not of sound mind to enter into marriage contracts," Thomas said evenly, his voice carrying the careful control of barely contained anger. "Says the fever that took your legs also affected your mental faculties, making you susceptible." to manipulation by unscrupulous men seeking to gain control of your non-existent inheritance. Margaret felt a familiar cold settle in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced when watching her life auctioned away, piece by piece. He's trying to have the marriage blocked. More than that, he's petitioned the county court to have you declared incompetent and placed back under his guardianship. Thomas's hands clenched into fists on the table. He claims I'm taking advantage of a vulnerable woman for my own gain. The irony might have been laughable if it weren't so malicious. Cornelius, who had literally sold her to the highest bidder, was now positioning himself as her protector against Thomas, who had offered her partnership and love. "When's the hearing?" Margaret asked practically. "Friday. Judge Whitmore presiding." Thomas looked up from the letter, his brown eyes dark with worry. "Margaret, if they rule against us—" "They won't," she said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty, "because I'm going to prove beyond any doubt that my mind is perfectly sound and my choices are entirely my own." The next 3 days transformed into a whirlwind of preparation that showcased exactly the kind of strategic thinking Cornelius claimed Margaret was incapable of. She spent hours organizing documents, correspondence with agricultural journals, engineering sketches for ranch improvements, financial calculations that demonstrated her mathematical competency. Thomas contributed his own evidence, detailed accounts of Margaret's contributions to ranch operations, testimonials he'd gathered from neighbors who had witnessed her intelligence firsthand, documentation of improvements made under her guidance that had already increased the ranch's productivity. "Dr. Harrison from the county seat has agreed to examine you," Thomas announced Wednesday evening. "He'll provide medical testimony about your mental faculties." Margaret nodded, though the prospect of being examined and judged like livestock made her skin crawl. "What about character witnesses?" "That's trickier. Most folks around here barely know you, and what they do know is colored by how you arrived." Thomas hesitated. But there might be another approach. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, wife of the county's largest landowner and unofficial arbiter of social standing in Millbrook. Margaret had never spoken to the woman directly, but she knew her reputation. Sharp-minded, fair-minded, and utterly unimpressed by attempts to manipulate her opinions. "Miss Sinclair," Mrs. Whitman said as Thomas helped her down from her elegant carriage, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I've come to speak with you about tomorrow's proceedings." Margaret studied the older woman's face, searching for clues about her intentions. Eleanor Whitman was perhaps 50, with steel-grey hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of their surroundings. "Of course. Please come inside." Over tea in the parlour that Margaret had gradually made more welcoming with small touches, fresh flowers, books arranged on tables, cushions that spoke of care and attention, Mrs. Whitman proved surprisingly direct. "Your uncle has been quite vocal about his concerns for your welfare," she began. "He's painted a picture of a poor, addled creature being taken advantage of by a desperate widower. Naturally, this has created considerable gossip." "And what do you believe?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Whitman smiled, the expression transforming her austere features. "I believe in evidence over gossip. I've made some inquiries about your background, Miss Sinclair. Before your illness, you were known as one of the most intelligent young women in 3 counties. Your father often spoke proudly of your mathematical abilities and your understanding of land management." "You knew my father?" "James Sinclair was a good man who raised a remarkable daughter. The idea that fever could somehow erase intelligence while leaving everything else intact struck me as medically implausible." Mrs. Whitman sipped her tea thoughtfully. "So I decided to investigate for myself." What followed was the most thorough intellectual examination Margaret had ever experienced. Mrs. Whitman, it turned out, was no mere society matron, but a woman of considerable education who had managed her family's extensive business interests. For years, while her husband focused on politics, they discussed everything from poetry to agricultural science, from the latest engineering developments to the economic implications of railroad expansion. Margaret found herself energized by the conversation in a way that reminded her of her discussions with Thomas. Here was another mind that valued ideas over appearances, substance over convention. Remarkable, Mrs. Whitman murmured after Margaret had outlined her water management plans for the ranch, complete with calculations and contingency scenarios. Absolutely remarkable. Mr. Brennan, you found yourself quite a partner. Thomas, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward. Yes, ma'am, I believe I have. Miss Sinclair, Mrs. Whitman continued, would you be willing to present these plans to the Ladies' Agricultural Society? We meet monthly to discuss innovations in farming and ranching, and your ideas about water conservation would be invaluable to our members. Margaret felt her heart leap. Recognition of her ideas, invitation to contribute to the community's knowledge, these were things she had dreamed of but never dared to expect. I would be honored, she replied. Mrs. Whitman smiled again, this time with satisfaction. Excellent. I'll be testifying on your behalf tomorrow, Miss Sinclair, and I'll be bringing several other members of the Agricultural Society with me. We'll make it quite clear to Judge Whitmore that you're not only mentally competent, but intellectually gifted. That evening, as Margaret and Thomas reviewed their preparations for the hearing, a sense of determination settled over both of them. This was no longer just about defending Margaret's right to marry. It was about establishing her place in the community as a valued contributor rather than a burden to be shuffled between reluctant caretakers. Whatever happens tomorrow, Thomas said as they sat together by the fire, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the best of my life since Carolyn died. You've brought light back into this house, purpose back into my work, joy back into my days. Thomas, Margaret began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. If the judge rules against us, if they try to take you away, I won't stop fighting. I'll appeal to every court in the territory if necessary. You're not property to be traded back and forth. You're my partner, my equal, my chosen bride, and I'll defend your right to make your own choices with everything I have. Friday morning dawned, clear and cold, with frost glittering on the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Margaret dressed carefully in her best gown, not the wedding dress still being sewn, but a dignified blue wool that spoke of respectability without ostentation. Thomas wore his Sunday suit, clean-shaven and serious. The courthouse was packed, beyond capacity, with people spilling out onto the steps and craning their necks to see inside. Word of the hearing had spread throughout the county, drawing curious spectators and invested parties alike. Judge Whitmore was a thin, severe man known for his adherence to law over sentiment. He listened with apparent impartiality as Cornelius's attorney painted Margaret as a pitiful creature whose illness had left her vulnerable to manipulation by predatory men. Your Honor, the lawyer intoned, Miss Sinclair was once a woman of intelligence and capability, but the fever that crippled her body has clearly affected her judgment as well. No rational woman would agree to such an arrangement, sold like cattle at auction to a stranger who seeks only to exploit her vulnerability. When it was their turn, Thomas's attorney, a young man named David Morrison, who had recently passed the bar, presented their evidence methodically. Medical testimony from Dr. Harrison confirming Margaret's mental acuity, documentation of her contributions to ranch improvement. Character testimony from Mrs. Whitman and 3 other prominent citizens. But the turning point came when Judge Whitmore asked to question Margaret directly. Miss Sinclair, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, this court needs to determine whether you are capable of making reasoned decisions about your own future. Can you explain to me in your own words why you wish to marry Mr. Brennan? Margaret had prepared for this moment, but now, facing the packed courtroom and the judge's penetrating stare, she set aside her rehearsed speech and spoke from her heart. Your Honor, I wish to marry Thomas Brennan because he is the first person since my illness to see me as I am rather than as I was, or as others think I should be. He values my intelligence, seeks my opinions, and treats me as an equal partner. In all our endeavors, her voice grew stronger as she continued, I'm not a victim seeking rescue. I am a woman who has found a man whose character, values, and goals align with my own. I choose to marry him not from desperation or delusion, but from love and respect, and the rational calculation that we are better together than apart. And what do you bring to this partnership? Judge Whitmore asked. Margaret smiled, feeling suddenly calm and confident. I bring a mind trained in mathematics and engineering, capable of solving practical problems and improving operations. I bring dedication to building something lasting and meaningful. I bring love freely given rather than purchased or demanded. She paused, looking directly at her uncle. Most importantly, I bring the right to choose my own path rather than have others choose for me based on their convenience. The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried finality. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this court finds Miss Margaret Sinclair to be fully competent, mentally and legally capable of making her own decisions regarding marriage and personal affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied. The objection to marriage is overruled. He looked directly at Cornelius. Mr. Sinclair, your concerns appear to be motivated more by financial interest than genuine care for your niece's welfare. This court strongly discourages any further attempts to interfere with Miss Sinclair's legally protected right to determine her own future. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Margaret felt tears of relief and triumph sliding down her cheeks as Thomas squeezed her hand. They had won more than just the right to marry. They had established her standing as a full citizen rather than a dependent ward. As they left the courthouse together, Mrs. Whitman approached with several other ladies in tow. Miss Sinclair, she said warmly, I do hope you'll still consider presenting to our agricultural society next Friday at 2 o'clock, if you're available. I wouldn't miss it, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling in her chest. That evening, as they celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had transformed. 6 weeks ago, she had property sold at auction. Now she was a recognized member of the community, valued for her contributions and respected for her intelligence. No more obstacles, Thomas said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. Nothing standing between us and our wedding except the time it takes to finish your dress. No more obstacles, Margaret agreed, touching her cup to his. Just possibilities. Outside, winter was tightening its grip on the prairie, but inside their home, their true home now, legally and emotionally, warmth and light and the promise of spring filled every corner. They had fought for the right to choose each other, and they had won. Everything else was just details to be worked out together as partners, as equals, as two people who had discovered that love could triumph over both circumstance and prejudice. When it was built on genuine respect and shared purpose, the wedding dress would be finished soon. The banns had been posted, and their future stretched ahead of them, like an unwritten page, waiting to be filled with all the dreams they would build together. Spring arrived early that year, melting the last stubborn patches of snow by mid-March, and bringing with it a restless energy that seemed to pulse through every living thing on the ranch. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas work with a new horse in the corral, her wedding dress hanging finished and pressed behind her, waiting for the ceremony now, just 3 days away. The dress was magnificent, ivory silk with Pearl buttons and delicate embroidery around the neckline, created by seamstresses who had whispered their excitement as they worked. Word of the upcoming wedding had spread throughout the county, and what had begun as a scandal had transformed into something approaching celebration. The strange love story of the rancher and the woman from the auction block had captured imaginations in ways neither Margaret nor Thomas had anticipated. "Mrs. Brennan," Margaret said aloud to her reflection in the window glass, testing how the name felt on her tongue. It settled there comfortably, like coming home. A knock at the door interrupted her musings. Thomas was still in the corral, so Margaret wheeled herself to answer it, expecting perhaps a delivery of wedding flowers or another well-wisher bearing gifts. Instead, she found herself facing a woman she didn't recognize, tall and elegant, with prematurely grey hair and eyes the exact shade of brown as Thomas's. "You must be Margaret," the woman said, her voice carrying traces of the same cadence as Thomas's speech. "I'm Sarah Brennan Mitchell, Thomas's sister." Margaret's breath caught. Thomas had mentioned Sarah only once, briefly, saying she lived in Denver with her husband and children. He had written to inform her of the wedding, but they had received no response and assumed she wouldn't attend. "Please come in," Margaret said, stepping back to allow Sarah entry. "Thomas will be so pleased you're here. He's just outside with the horses." Sarah entered slowly, her gaze taking in every detail of the house, the flowers Margaret had arranged, the books scattered on tables, the subtle changes that marked a home where someone lived rather than merely existed. Her examination felt thorough and perhaps critical, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "I'll call Thomas," Margaret began, but Sarah held up a hand. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first, privately." Margaret's heart sank. She had hoped the legal victory would mark the end of challenges to their union, but perhaps family. Opposition would prove more difficult to overcome than legal obstacles. "Of course, please sit." Sarah chose the chair across from Margaret's usual spot by the fire, her posture perfect but tense. For a long moment, she simply studied Margaret's face, as if searching for something specific. "Thomas wrote that you were remarkable," Sarah said finally. "That you had transformed not just his house, but his entire outlook on life. I confess, I was skeptical. And now? Now I see that he understated things considerably." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "This house feels alive again. When I visited after Caroline's funeral, it was like a tomb, everything preserved exactly as it had been, but empty of warmth or purpose. What you've done here, it's not decoration, it's resurrection." Margaret felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Thomas had simply stopped living. All he needed was a reason to start again. And you gave him that reason. "We gave it to each other," Margaret corrected gently. "I was just as lost as he was, in different ways. We found purpose, together." Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Margaret, I need to tell you something about Thomas that he might not have shared. When Caroline died, he blamed himself, not rationally. Everyone knew it was cholera, that there was nothing anyone could have done. But Thomas convinced himself that if he had been a better husband, a better provider, somehow he could have prevented it." Margaret's chest tightened. Thomas had spoken of grief, but never of guilt. "He stopped taking care of himself," Sarah continued. "Stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, worked himself nearly to death trying to exhaust the pain. I was terrified he would follow Caroline to the grave, not from illness, but from sheer refusal to continue living." "That must have been frightening." "For you, it was. And it's why I was initially concerned about this marriage. I worried that he was trying to replace Caroline, to fill a hole that couldn't be filled. I was afraid you might become another weight on his conscience if things went wrong." Margaret nodded, understanding the source of Sarah's caution. "And what do you think now?" Sarah smiled then, the first genuine warmth Margaret had seen from her. Now I think Thomas has found something entirely different from what he had with Caroline. Not replacement, but renewal. Not an attempt to recapture the past, but courage to build a different future. The sound of boots on the porch announced Thomas's approach. Sarah stood quickly, smoothing her skirts. "Please don't tell him." "I shared that," she said quietly. "He's intensely private about his struggles." "Of course not." Thomas burst through the door, his face lighting up when he saw his sister. "Sarah, you came!" The reunion was warm, but restrained in the way of siblings who love each other deeply, but express it through actions rather than elaborate displays. Sarah congratulated Thomas on his upcoming marriage, admired the improvements to the ranch, and gracefully accepted his invitation to stay through the wedding. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky. In shades of rose and gold, Sarah shared news from Denver. Her husband's law practice was thriving. Her children were growing too fast. The city was expanding rapidly as more people moved west, seeking opportunities. "And what about you two?" Sarah asked. "What are your plans after the wedding? Besides ranching, I mean." Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances, the comfortable look of partners who had discussed their dreams thoroughly. "We're planning to expand the water management system," Thomas said. "Margaret's designed something that could transform not just our ranch, but potentially help other operations in the area." "I'm also going to start teaching," Margaret added. "Mrs. Whitman has arranged for me to offer mathematics and engineering instruction to young people who want to learn but can't afford formal schooling." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's quite ambitious." "The frontier needs educated people," Margaret explained. "Engineers, mathematicians, scientists. But most families can't send their children east for schooling. If we can provide that education here, we can help build the kind of communities we want to live in." Margaret's already been invited to present her water conservation ideas to agricultural societies in 3 counties, Thomas added with obvious pride. There's talk of her consulting on irrigation projects for the territorial government. As they talked, Margaret felt the last of her nervousness about meeting Thomas's family dissolve. Sarah was clearly intelligent and caring, someone who would become not just a sister-in-law, but a genuine friend. More importantly, her approval of their marriage carried weight that would matter to Thomas, even if he claimed not to need it. The next morning brought a flurry of wedding preparations. Sarah proved invaluable in handling details that might have overwhelmed Margaret. Coordinating with the church, organizing the reception dinner, ensuring that everything proceeded smoothly. Her presence also lent additional respectability to the proceedings, signaling to any remaining skeptics that the Brennan family fully supported this union. "You know," Sarah said as they arranged flowers in the church sanctuary, "I was worried that Thomas might be trying to recreate his life with Caroline. But watching you two together, I realize this is something completely new. You complement each other in ways that Caroline and Thomas never did." "How so?" "Caroline was wonderful, but she was content to let Thomas make all the decisions about their life together. She trusted his judgment completely and rarely challenged his ideas." Sarah paused in her flower arranging. "You, on the other hand, engage with him as an equal. You argue when you disagree, contribute your own ideas, push him to think differently. It's exactly what he needs." Margaret smiled, remembering their discussions about water management and ranch planning. "He pushes me too, encourages me to trust my own knowledge even when others doubt it. That's what I mean. You're partners in the truest sense." The wedding morning dawned bright and clear, with a crispness in the air that promised a beautiful day. Margaret woke early, too excited to sleep, and found Thomas already up and dressed for the barn work that couldn't wait even for weddings. "You're not supposed to see the bride on your wedding day," Margaret teased as he kissed her forehead before heading out. "Old superstitions," Thomas replied with a grin. "Besides, I've been seeing you every day for months. Why would today be different? By noon, the small church was packed with more people than Margaret had expected. Mrs. Whitman sat in the front row with several members of the Agricultural Society. Dr. Harrison was there with his wife, as were neighbors from throughout the county who had come to witness what many were calling the wedding of the decade. Even Uncle Cornelius had come, though whether from genuine reconciliation or simple curiosity was unclear. Margaret chose to interpret his presence charitably. After all, she could afford to be generous in victory. As Sarah helped her into the wedding dress, Margaret marveled at how different this day felt from anything she had imagined during those dark months when her future seemed to hold nothing but dependence and decline. The woman in the mirror was radiant, not with artificial enhancement, but with genuine happiness, with the confidence that came from being truly valued and loved. "Ready?" Sarah asked, adjusting the pearl necklace that had been Caroline's and was now offered as something borrowed. "More than ready," Margaret replied. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Thomas waited at the altar looking handsome and nervous, his best man, a neighboring rancher named Jack Sullivan, standing proudly beside him. When Margaret appeared in the doorway, pushed down the aisle by Billy Fletcher in the absence of any male relative willing to perform the traditional role, the entire congregation seemed to hold its breath. But Margaret had eyes only for Thomas, whose face lit up with such joy and love that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. "You may kiss your bride," the minister announced, and Thomas did so with a tenderness that spoke of reverence for the gift he had been given. The reception, held in the church hall, was a joyous affair that lasted well into the evening. Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom expressed genuine pleasure at the match. The transformation from scandal to celebration was complete. They were no longer the odd couple who had shocked the county, but the love story that had captured hearts and proved that happiness could bloom in the most unexpected soil. As the evening wound down and they prepared to return to the ranch, their ranch now, legally and emotionally, Margaret reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. 6 months ago she was sold at auction like livestock. Tonight she was Mrs. Thomas Brennan, respected member of the community, beloved wife, and partner in every sense of the word. "Happy?" Thomas asked as they settled into the wagon for the ride home, Margaret's wedding dress carefully preserved. "For future generations." "Beyond words," Margaret replied, leaning into his shoulder as the stars appeared overhead. "Though I think complete might be more accurate." They drove home through the spring night, past pastures where their cattle grazed, peacefully, and water flowed through channels Margaret had designed. Behind them lay the church where they had pledged their lives to each other. Ahead lay the house where they would build their future together, day by day, decision by decision, dream by dream. The ranch looked different in the moonlight, not just a place where Thomas had survived his grief, but a foundation for the life they would create together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to celebrate the partnership they had forged against all odds. But tonight was perfect just as it was. Two people who had found in each other not rescue from their circumstances, but the courage to transform those circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. The auction block seemed like a lifetime ago, a necessary wrong turn that had somehow led them exactly where they belonged. Mrs. Margaret Brennan was finally home. 2 months into their marriage, Margaret stood before the territorial governor's panel of agricultural advisors, her detailed drawings spread across the mahogany conference table in the Capitol building. The men around the table, weathered ranchers, government officials, and university professors, leaned forward with obvious interest as she explained her revolutionary approach to water conservation across the high plains. "The key is thinking systematically rather than addressing each drought or flood as an isolated crisis," Margaret said, using a wooden pointer to indicate various features on her comprehensive diagram. By creating a network of interconnected reservoirs and channels, we can capture excess water during abundant periods and redistribute it during scarcity. Governor Matthews, a pragmatic man known for his careful consideration of proposals, studied the engineering calculations with obvious respect. Mrs. Brennan, the scope of what you're suggesting would require coordination between multiple counties, significant initial investment, and years of construction. What makes you confident this approach would succeed where smaller-scale efforts have failed? Margaret had anticipated this question. She moved to a second set of drawings, showing the Brennan Ranch's water system, now in its third month of operation. Because we've already proven the concept works, Governor. Our ranch has increased its sustainable cattle capacity by 40%, while using 20% less water than conventional methods. During last month's dry spell, when neighboring operations were struggling, our system provided steady, reliable water flow. Professor Chen from the Territorial University examined the mathematical calculations underlying Margaret's projections. Your engineering is sound, Mrs. Brennan, but the political challenges of coordinating such an effort across county lines are considerable, but not insurmountable, Margaret finished. I've already presented these plans to agricultural societies in 5 counties. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Ranchers understand that water scarcity threatens everyone equally and that solutions require cooperation rather than competition. The room fell silent as the men absorbed the implications of her proposal. Finally, Governor Matthews spoke. Mrs. Brennan, would you be willing to serve as the territorial consultant for water management development? The position would involve significant travel, working with local communities to implement pilot programs. Margaret felt her heart race. Such a position would provide an unprecedented opportunity to implement her ideas on a scale that could transform agriculture across the territory. It would also establish her as one of the few women holding significant government advisory roles. I would be honored, Governor. However, I should mention that my husband and I operate our ranch as full partners. Any position I accept would need to accommodate my ongoing responsibilities there. Of course, we wouldn't expect otherwise. Governor Matthews smiled. In fact, Mr. Brennan's practical experience implementing these systems would make him an invaluable part of any consulting work. Would both of you be available to travel as a team? This was beyond anything Margaret had dared hope for. Not just professional recognition, but acknowledgement that her partnership with Thomas represented a model worth replicating. We would, Governor. 3 weeks later, Margaret and Thomas found themselves in Cheyenne, working with local ranchers to design the territory's first multi-county water conservation project. The work was challenging and rewarding in equal measure, requiring Margaret to adapt her engineering principles to different terrain and climates, while Thomas provided practical insights about implementation challenges. Their hotel room had been transformed into a makeshift office, with maps covering every surface and correspondence stacked on the writing desk. Margaret worked at a table Thomas had positioned at the perfect height for her chair, while he reviewed financial projections and supply lists on the bed. The Peterson Ranch presents an interesting challenge, Margaret mused, studying topographical surveys. The land slopes in 3 directions, which creates complex drainage patterns. But if we can harness that complexity, we could create natural distribution points that serve multiple properties simultaneously, Thomas finished, looking up from his calculations. Reduce the individual cost burden while increasing overall efficiency. This kind of intellectual partnership had become their new normal. Minds working in harmony to solve problems neither could address alone. Margaret's theoretical knowledge combined with Thomas's practical experience created solutions that consistently exceeded expectations. A knock at the door interrupted their work. Thomas opened it to find a young woman in a traveling dress. Her face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Emily Rodriguez. I've traveled from Santa Fe to meet with you." Margaret wheeled over to greet their unexpected visitor. "Please, come in, Miss Rodriguez. What brings you so far from home?" Emily entered hesitantly, clearly overwhelmed by the informal setting, but determined to state her purpose. "I'm a mathematics teacher, Mrs. Brennan. Or rather, I was, until the school board decided that advanced mathematics was inappropriate for young ladies to learn, and therefore inappropriate for women to teach." Margaret's jaw tightened. Such attitudes were unfortunately common, even in communities that claimed to value education. "I've read about your work," Emily continued, "your consulting position with the territorial government, your engineering innovations. I was hoping, that is, I wondered if you might need an assistant, someone to help with calculations, correspondence, documentation of projects." Margaret looked at Thomas, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. Their work was expanding rapidly, and they could indeed use intelligent assistance. But more importantly, here was an opportunity to support another woman whose talents were being wasted by narrow-minded prejudice. "Miss Rodriguez," Margaret said carefully, "the work we do involves extensive travel, often to remote locations, with basic accommodations. The hours are irregular, the conditions sometimes difficult. Are you prepared for such challenges?" "Mrs. Brennan, I've been teaching arithmetic to children whose families believe education is a waste of time for girls. I've been defending the value of mathematical knowledge to school boards who think women's minds are too delicate for complex thinking. I believe I can handle whatever challenges your work might present." Margaret smiled at the young woman's determination. "Then welcome to our team, Miss Rodriguez. We leave for Colorado next week to survey potential sites for a mountain watershed project. I hope you're prepared to learn engineering by doing." 6 months into their consulting work, the Brennan team had become legendary throughout the territory. Margaret's engineering genius, Thomas's practical wisdom, and Emily's mathematical precision created a combination that consistently delivered results beyond client expectations. But more than their professional success, they had become symbols of what was possible when talent was valued over convention. Their current project, a comprehensive water management system for the Arkansas River Valley, represented their most ambitious undertaking yet. Working with 17 ranches across 4 counties, they were creating an integrated network that would provide drought protection for over 100,000 acres of grazing land. Margaret stood on a hillside overlooking the valley, surveying stakes that marked the locations of future reservoirs and channels. Below, Thomas worked with local crews to test soil composition at potential dam sites. Emily sat at a portable table nearby, calculating flow rates and storage capacities with the focused intensity Margaret had come to appreciate. The morning light shows the terrain differently, Margaret observed, noting how shadows revealed subtle elevation changes invisible at midday. "Emily, we need to recalculate the eastern approach based on this ridgeline being 3 feet higher than our original," survey indicated. "Already working on it," Emily replied, without looking up from her calculations. "The elevation change actually improves our gravity flow potential by 8%. This was the kind of moment Margaret treasured. Professional challenges solved. Through collaborative expertise, minds working together towards solutions that benefited entire communities. It was everything she had dreamed of during those dark months when her future seemed limited to dependence and decline. Mrs. Brennan, a rider, approached at full gallop, dust trailing behind his horse. "Message from Governor Matthews, urgent." Margaret accepted the telegram with growing concern. Urgent messages usually meant problems, funding issues, political opposition, or technical complications that threatened project completion. But as she read, her expression shifted from worry to amazement. "Thomas, Emily, come quickly!" They gathered around as Margaret read aloud, "Congressional Committee visiting territory next month to evaluate Western development initiatives. Request your presence as expert witness on water resource management. Your Arkansas Valley project has gained national attention as a model for arid land agriculture. Prepare a comprehensive presentation for committee review." The implications were staggering. Congressional attention meant potential federal funding for water management projects across the entire western frontier. It meant national recognition for their work, validation of Margaret's engineering principles on the largest possible stage. "A congressional committee," Emily breathed. "Margaret, this could change everything." "It could change everything for everyone," Margaret corrected. "Every farmer struggling with drought, every rancher losing cattle to water scarcity, every community trying to grow in challenging climates. This is our chance to prove that intelligent water management can transform the entire western frontier." That evening, as they worked by lamplight in their temporary headquarters, a converted barn that served as both office and lodging, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, she had been auctioned as a burden too costly for her own family to bear. Now, she was preparing to testify before Congress about solutions that could reshape American agriculture. "Nervous?" Thomas asked, looking up from the supply lists he was organizing for their return to the ranch. "Excited," Margaret replied. "This is what we've been working toward, the chance to implement these ideas on a scale that truly matters." "And if Congress approves federal funding?" Margaret smiled, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Then we hire Emily permanently, establish a proper consulting firm, and prove that women can be just as effective as men at solving the challenges facing our growing nation." Emily looked up from her correspondence. "You'd really want me as a permanent partner?" "Emily, you've calculated flow rates for 17 different topographical situations, managed correspondence with 4 county governments, and helped design engineering solutions for problems that had no precedent," Margaret said firmly. "You're not just an assistant anymore. You're an engineer in your own right." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "My family said I was wasting my education on impossible dreams. They said no one would ever value what a woman could contribute to such work." "Your family was wrong," Thomas said gently. "And you're about to help prove it to the entire country." As they continued their preparations, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, recognition that was earned rather than granted, and partnership that multiplied rather than limited individual potential. The congressional hearing would be crucial, but regardless of its outcome, they had already accomplished something remarkable. They had proven that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, even ones as fundamental as society's assumptions about what women could achieve. Margaret's engineering had transformed not just water management practices, but perceptions about female capability. Emily's mathematical precision had earned respect from university professors and government officials. Together, they were changing minds as efficiently as they changed landscapes. The auction block seemed like something from another lifetime, a necessary tragedy that had somehow led to unexpected triumph. Margaret no longer thought about what she had lost to illness or prejudice. Instead, she focused on what she and Thomas and Emily were building together. Not just water systems and ranch improvements, but a future where talent mattered more than convention, where partnerships could transcend traditional limitations, where love and respect could create possibilities that none of them could have imagined alone. Outside their makeshift office, the Arkansas River flowed steadily toward destinations unknown, carrying water that would nourish crops and sustain communities for hundreds of miles downstream. Inside, three minds worked together to ensure that flow would continue reliably for generations to come, regardless of what challenges the climate might present. It was, Margaret reflected, exactly the kind of work she had been born to do. Not despite her circumstances, but because of everything those circumstances had taught her about resilience, innovation, and the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was perfect. Productive work, valued partnerships, and the quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlast them all. 5 years after the congressional hearing that transformed water management across the American frontier, Margaret Brennan stood in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, surrounded by delegates from the International Congress of Engineering Sciences. The woman who had once been sold at auction for $200 now commanded audiences of the world's most brilliant minds. Her innovations in hydraulic engineering, studied in universities from Boston to Berlin. The principles we developed in the Colorado Territory, Margaret explained to the assembled engineers, gesturing toward detailed schematics displayed on easels throughout the room, have applications far beyond arid land agriculture, urban water distribution, industrial cooling systems, even flood control in river deltas. All can benefit from integrated network approaches rather than isolated solutions. Professor Heinrich Zimmermann from the Vienna Technical Institute leaned forward with obvious interest. Mrs. Brennan, your Cascade Reservoir system has revolutionized drought management across 3 American territories. But how might these techniques adapt to alpine watersheds with entirely different precipitation patterns? Margaret smiled, her mind already visualizing the engineering challenges presented by European mountain systems. Professor, the fundamental mathematics remain constant. Water seeks the most efficient path, regardless of geography. What changes is how we work with local terrain rather than against it. In alpine regions, we would harness elevation changes more aggressively, using steep gradients to create pressure differentials that could power distribution without external energy sources. The discussion that followed was exactly the kind of intellectual challenge Margaret thrived on. Complex problems requiring innovative solutions, minds from different cultures and disciplines collaborating to push the boundaries of what was possible. 23 countries were represented in this room, yet the language of engineering created immediate understanding across all barriers. Thomas entered quietly from the corridor, having just concluded his own presentation to the Agricultural Development Panel. Their partnership had evolved over the years to encompass not just their original ranch operations, but a consulting firm that employed 17 engineers and had completed projects across 4 nations. Margaret handled the theoretical innovation while Thomas managed practical implementation, their different strengths creating solutions neither could achieve alone. How did the agricultural session respond to the grain storage proposals? Margaret asked, as he approached during a break in the technical discussions. Enthusiastically, the French delegation wants to implement pilot programs in Provence immediately. The Italians are interested in adapting the techniques for olive grove irrigation. Thomas paused, studying her expression with the careful attention of someone who knew her moods intimately. "But you're thinking about something else entirely, aren't you?" Margaret nodded toward the hotel windows, where Chicago's rapidly expanding skyline stretched toward Lake Michigan. All this urban growth, all these people crowding into cities, they're going to need water systems far more complex than anything we've designed for rural areas. And most city planners are still thinking in terms of simple pipes and pumps rather than integrated networks. Urban hydraulic engineering, Thomas mused. That would be a completely new field. Exactly. And we could pioneer it. Margaret's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm Thomas had learned to recognize as the prelude to their next great adventure. Imagine water systems that could serve millions of people efficiently, waste management integrated with supply distribution, emergency reserves that could function during disasters. Before Thomas could respond, Emily Rodriguez approached with a telegram in her hand and excitement radiating from her features. Emily had not only become their firm's chief mathematician, but had also earned her formal engineering degree through correspondence courses, becoming one of the first women certified as a professional engineer in North America. "Margaret, Thomas, you need to see this immediately." Emily's voice carried the kind of urgency reserved for truly momentous news. Margaret accepted the telegram and read quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to amazement to something approaching awe. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "An invitation from the Smithsonian Institution. They want to establish a permanent exhibit featuring our water management innovations as examples of American engineering excellence." Margaret looked up from the telegram. "They're calling it Pioneers of the New Frontier, how innovation transforms impossibility into opportunity." Emily practically bounced with excitement. "Margaret, do you understand what this means? Your work will be preserved for future generations, studied by students and researchers for decades to come." The full implications were staggering. Margaret's engineering principles, developed from necessity on a struggling ranch, would now be documented as contributions to human knowledge worthy of permanent preservation, alongside the greatest achievements in American science and industry. "There's more," Margaret continued reading. "They want to include the personal story alongside the technical innovations, how you came to develop these techniques, the partnership that made them possible, the broader implications for women in engineering and science." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the significance of this recognition. "From an auction block to the Smithsonian Institution," he said finally. "Margaret, do you realize what you've accomplished?" "What we've accomplished," Margaret corrected firmly. "None of this would have been possible without our partnership, without Emily's mathematical expertise, without the community of minds we've built around us." That evening, as Chicago's lights twinkled below their hotel windows, the three partners sat together planning their response to the Smithsonian invitation. Maps and technical drawings covered every surface of their suite. But tonight, they were planning something more significant than engineering projects. They were deciding how to tell a story that could inspire future generations. The exhibit should emphasize that innovation comes from necessity rather than privilege, Margaret said, sketching layout ideas on hotel stationery. "Too many people assume that great achievements require perfect circumstances. Our story proves that obstacles can become advantages if you refuse to accept limitations." Emily looked up from the correspondence she was organizing. "What about including examples of other women who have overcome similar challenges? Your story is remarkable, but it's not unique. There are female inventors, scientists, mathematicians whose work has been overlooked simply because of their gender." "Brilliant idea," Thomas agreed. "Frame Margaret's achievements within the broader context of women's capabilities being systematically underestimated and underutilized." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "We could create something that's not just about water management, but about recognizing talent regardless of where it's found or what form it takes." A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Thomas opened it to find a young woman in a traveling dress, her face bearing the same determined expression Emily had worn years earlier when she'd first sought them out. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Catherine Walsh. I've traveled from Boston to meet with you." Margaret recognized immediately the type of visitor this was likely to be, another talented woman whose abilities were being dismissed or underutilized, seeking opportunity to contribute her skills to meaningful work. "Please, come in, Miss Walsh. What brings you so far from home?" Catherine entered hesitantly, but with obvious purpose. I'm a mechanical engineer, Mrs. Brennan, graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with highest honors, but every firm I've approached claims they don't hire women for technical positions. Margaret exchanged glances with Thomas and Emily. Their consulting firm had grown large enough to support additional specialists, and mechanical engineering expertise would perfectly complement their hydraulic innovations. Miss Walsh, Margaret said carefully, our work involves extensive travel, challenging conditions, and projects that often push the boundaries of established engineering practices. We also work as a team, where every member's contributions are valued equally regardless of gender. Are you prepared for such an environment? Mrs. Brennan, I've spent 3 years being told that my engineering degree is worthless because I'm female. I've had professors who praised my technical innovations refuse to recommend me for positions because they believed women lack the temperament for engineering work. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued, I'm not just prepared for challenging work, I'm desperate for the chance to prove what I can accomplish when given real opportunities. Margaret smiled, remembering her own desperation for meaningful work, her hunger to contribute something valuable to the world. Then welcome to Brennan Engineering Associates, Miss Walsh. I hope you're prepared to help us revolutionize urban water systems, because that's our next major undertaking. 6 months later, Margaret stood before the completed Smithsonian exhibit, studying the display cases that chronicled her journey from auction block to international recognition. The exhibit was more comprehensive than she had imagined, featuring not only her engineering innovations, but interactive demonstrations that allowed visitors to understand the mathematical principles underlying water network design. But what moved her most profoundly was the section Emily had insisted on including, profiles of dozens of women whose talents had been overlooked or dismissed, whose potential contributions to science and engineering were only now beginning to be recognized. Margaret's story was presented not as an isolated triumph, but as an example of what became possible when society began valuing intelligence over convention. The visitor response has been extraordinary, Dr. Samuel Langley, the Smithsonian's director, informed her as they toured the completed exhibit. We've had delegations from 7 universities request copies of your technical papers for their engineering curricula. 3 foreign governments have inquired about consulting contracts for infrastructure development. Thomas appeared beside them, having just finished reviewing the agricultural display with visiting researchers from the Department of Agriculture. Dr. Langley, the interactive watershed model is particularly impressive. Students can experiment with different variables and see immediately how changes affect the entire system. That was Miss Rodriguez's innovation, Dr. Langley replied. She insisted that mathematical concepts become much clearer when people can manipulate them directly rather than simply reading about them. Margaret felt profound satisfaction knowing that Emily's educational instincts were now influencing how engineering was taught at the national level. Their partnership had grown beyond consulting into something approaching a movement, proving that collaborative approaches produced better results than individual competition. As they concluded their tour, Margaret paused before the final display panel, which featured a photograph of their current team. Herself, Thomas, Emily, Catherine, and 12 other engineers and mathematicians who had joined their firm over the years, women and men working together on projects that were transforming infrastructure development across multiple continents. The photograph's caption read, "Brennan Engineering Associates," proving that innovation flourishes when talent is valued over tradition, when partnership replaces hierarchy, and when society recognizes that great minds come in many forms. Regrets? Thomas asked softly, understanding the contemplative mood that sometimes overtook her during moments of reflection. Margaret considered the question seriously. Her life had taken a path she could never have imagined, from the desperate woman sold at auction to the internationally recognized engineer whose innovations were studied worldwide. The journey had been challenging, sometimes painful, but ultimately transformative in ways that extended far beyond personal success. "No regrets," she said finally. "Not about the illness that changed my life's direction. Not about the circumstances that brought us together. Not about any of the obstacles we've overcome. Everything led to this, to work that matters, partnerships that strengthen us all, and the knowledge that we've helped prove what's possible when people refuse to accept other people's limitations." That evening, at the reception hosted by the Smithsonian to celebrate the exhibit's opening, Margaret found herself surrounded by young women who had traveled considerable distances to meet her. Students, teachers, aspiring engineers and scientists who saw in her story proof that their own ambitions were achievable. "Mrs. Brennan," one young woman asked during the question session, "what advice would you give to women who want to pursue careers in engineering but face families and communities that discourage such ambitions?" Margaret thought of her uncle, Cornelius, who had tried to convince a court that her mind was too damaged to make her own decisions. She thought of the dressmaker who had been shocked by the idea of a wedding dress for the woman sold at auction. She thought of every person who had looked at her chair and seen limitation rather than possibility. "Trust your own mind more than other people's fears," Margaret replied. "Seek out partners who value your intelligence rather than tolerate your presence. And remember that the greatest innovations often come from people who have learned to solve problems others consider insurmountable." Another young woman raised her hand. "How do you maintain confidence when facing constant skepticism about women's capabilities?" "By focusing on results rather than opinions," Margaret answered. "Let your work speak louder than critics' voices. Build partnerships with people who judge you by your contributions rather than your gender. And remember that every problem you solve makes it easier for the women who follow to be taken seriously." As the evening concluded and guests began departing, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. The woman who had once been considered too broken for marriage had become a role model for young women across the nation. The partnership that had begun as a transaction had evolved into a collaboration that was changing how society understood both engineering and the potential for women's contributions to scientific progress. Thomas wheeled her onto the hotel balcony, overlooking the Potomac River, where they could watch the lights of Washington reflecting on the water. Emily and Catherine joined them, the four partners who had built something none of them could have achieved alone. "What's next?" Emily asked, always thinking ahead to future challenges and opportunities. Margaret smiled, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Urban water systems, certainly. But I'm also thinking about transportation infrastructure, communication networks, even architectural innovations for buildings that must accommodate people with different physical capabilities." "The world is changing rapidly," Catherine observed. "Immigration, industrialization, urbanization, all creating challenges that will require entirely new approaches to engineering and design, which means endless opportunities for minds willing to think differently," Thomas added, "for partnerships that value innovation over tradition." Margaret reached for Thomas's hand as they watched a steamboat navigate the river below, its lights cutting through the darkness with purposeful determination. 26 years old, internationally recognized, surrounded by partners who valued her mind and contributions, she had achieved everything she had once thought impossible. But more than personal success, she had helped prove that society's assumptions about human potential were often wrong, that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that love and partnership could create possibilities no one could imagine alone. The auction block was a lifetime away, but Margaret never forgot the lesson it had taught her, that your value is not determined by how others choose to see you, but by what you choose to build, with whatever circumstances life provides. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that innovation and partnership could transform impossibility into achievement. But tonight was perfect, meaningful work completed, valued partnerships strengthened, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had changed not just their own lives, but the world's understanding of what was possible when talent was finally allowed to flourish without limitation. In the distance, the lights of the nation's capital twinkled like promises yet to be fulfilled, like dreams waiting to be built by minds brave enough to see beyond convention to possibility. The following morning brought news that would reshape their understanding of what their work had accomplished. Dr. Langley arrived at their hotel with a leather portfolio containing correspondence from around the world, letters from engineers in Japan requesting technical specifications for earthquake-resistant reservoir systems, inquiries from British colonial administrators about adapting their techniques for monsoon management in India, proposals from Dutch engineers for collaborative projects in land reclamation. Mrs. Brennan, Dr. Langley said, as he spread the international correspondence across their breakfast table, your exhibit has generated more global interest than any engineering display in the Smithsonian's history. We're receiving requests for traveling versions of the exhibit, invitations for you to address scientific societies on 4 continents. Margaret studied a letter written in careful English by Professor Tanaka from the Imperial University of Tokyo. His request was particularly intriguing. Japan's mountainous terrain and frequent seismic activity created water management challenges unlike anything she had encountered in the American territories. Thomas, look at this, she said, passing him the Japanese correspondence. There, dealing with systems that must function normally during earthquakes, maintain structural integrity during earth movement, yet still provide reliable water distribution to growing urban populations. Thomas read carefully, his engineering mind immediately grasping the complexity of the challenge. The mathematics alone would be staggering. You'd need to calculate not just normal flow patterns, but how those patterns would shift during ground instability. Emily leaned over to examine the technical drawings Professor Tanaka had included with his letter. The seismic considerations add an entirely new dimension to hydraulic engineering. We'd be pioneering techniques that could protect millions of people from water system failures during natural disasters. Catherine, ever practical, was reviewing the logistical implications. A project of this scope would require establishing an international office, training local engineers in our techniques, adapting our principles to completely different geological conditions. The enormity of what was being proposed gradually became clear. They weren't just being invited to consult on individual projects, but to establish a global network of engineering innovation that could address water management challenges across radically different environments and cultures. There's something else, Dr. Langley continued, producing a telegram bearing the seal of the White House. President McKinley would like to meet with you personally. The administration is considering establishing a new federal department focused on infrastructure development, and your innovations are being studied as potential models for national implementation. Margaret felt the familiar thrill of intellectual challenge combined with the sobering weight of responsibility. Presidential attention meant their work had implications far beyond individual consulting projects. They were being considered as advisors for policies that could affect millions of Americans. When does the president want to meet? Thomas asked. Next week, if you're available. He's particularly interested in your approaches to interstate water management coordination. Dr. Langley paused, clearly impressed by the scope of interest their work had generated. Mrs. Brennan, I think you should understand that you're not just being recognized as an engineer anymore. You're being consulted as an architect of national policy. That afternoon, as they walked through the exhibit one final time before departing Washington, Margaret paused before a display case containing artifacts from her early life. A photograph of her father's ranch, a sample of her mathematical calculations. From before her illness, a copy of the auction notice that had advertised her sale in Millbrook. "Strange to see your entire life reduced to museum artifacts," Thomas observed, standing beside her as visitors moved past, reading the story of her transformation with obvious fascination. "Not reduced," Margaret corrected thoughtfully. "Preserved, transformed into something that can inspire others long after we're gone." She studied the auction notice, remembering the humiliation and terror of that day. That woman who was sold for $200, she had no idea what she was capable of becoming. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve while staring at Margaret's wheelchair. "Mama, is that the lady from the pictures, the one who built all the water systems?" The mother, clearly embarrassed by her daughter's directness, tried to hush her, but Margaret wheeled closer with a warm smile. "Yes, I'm Margaret Brennan. Would you like to know how the water systems work?" The girl nodded eagerly, her curiosity overcoming any awkwardness about Margaret's chair. Margaret spent several minutes explaining the basic principles of gravity flow and reservoir networks, using simple language that made complex engineering concepts accessible to a child's understanding. "Could I build water systems when I grow up?" the girl asked. "If you study mathematics and science, if you learn to see problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be avoided, you can build anything you set your mind to." Margaret replied, "The most important thing is never letting anyone convince you that you're not capable of achieving your dreams." As the family moved on, the mother turned back with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she mouthed silently, and Margaret understood that she wasn't just being thanked for explaining engineering concepts, but for showing her daughter that physical limitations didn't define a person's potential. The meeting with President McKinley took place in the Oval Office on a crisp October morning, with autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting geometric patterns across the presidential desk. McKinley was a practical man known for his interest in industrial development and economic growth, and he listened with obvious attention as Margaret outlined the potential for national water infrastructure coordination. "Mrs. Brennan," the president said after she had concluded her presentation, "your innovations could theoretically be scaled to address water challenges across the entire western frontier. But the political complexities of coordinating such efforts between states, the funding requirements, the technical challenges of standardizing approaches across different regions are considerable but not insurmountable, Mr. President." Margaret replied confidently, "We've already demonstrated successful multi-county coordination in Colorado. The principles scale upward if you have the administrative framework to support implementation." Thomas added his perspective on the practical aspects. "Sir, the economic benefits alone would justify federal investment. Reliable water systems, increase agricultural productivity, support industrial development, enable population growth in previously marginal areas. The initial costs would be recovered many times over through economic expansion." Emily contributed the mathematical analysis. "Our calculations suggest that a national water management system could increase Western agricultural output by 40%, while reducing water waste by 60%. The economic impact would be transformational." President McKinley studied the comprehensive proposal they had prepared, his expression thoughtful. "And you believe this could be accomplished without federal oversight becoming bureaucratic interference? The key is establishing standards and coordination frameworks while allowing local adaptation to specific conditions," Margaret explained. "Federal involvement should focus on enabling innovation rather than mandating uniformity." Catherine, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up from her calculations. Mr. President, we've also identified potential applications for similar approaches to transportation infrastructure, communication networks, even urban planning. The principles of systematic integration could revolutionize multiple aspects of national development. The president was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of what they were proposing. Finally, he spoke with the deliberation of someone making historically significant decisions. Mrs. Brennan, I'm prepared to support legislation establishing a new Department of Infrastructure Innovation with you as its first director. The position would give you authority to coordinate development projects across multiple agencies, work with state and local governments to implement systematic approaches, and establish standards that could guide national growth for generations. The offer was beyond anything Margaret had imagined. Not just recognition of her engineering expertise, but appointment to a position where she could influence national policy on the largest possible scale. She would become one of the highest-ranking women in the federal government, with authority over projects affecting millions of Americans. Mr. President, Margaret said carefully, such a position would be an extraordinary honor. However, I would need to maintain my partnership with my colleagues. Our effectiveness comes from collaborative approaches rather than individual decision-making. Of course, your entire team would be appointed to senior positions within the new department. Mr. Brennan as Deputy Director for Implementation, Miss Rodriguez as Chief Mathematical Officer, Miss Walsh as Director of Technical Innovation. Thomas leaned forward. Sir, what about resistance from existing agencies, from Congress members who might oppose such extensive federal involvement in infrastructure development? President McKinley smiled. Mrs. Brennan's work speaks for itself. The results you've achieved, the international recognition you've earned, the proven economic benefits of your approaches, these provide powerful arguments for anyone who questions the value of systematic innovation. 3 months later, Margaret sat in her new office in the recently constructed Department of Infrastructure Innovation building, reviewing proposals from 17 states requesting federal assistance with water management projects. The view from her window encompassed the Washington Monument and the Potomac River, constant reminders of the democratic principles that had enabled her unlikely rise from auctioned property to federal department director. Her daily schedule was a carefully orchestrated balance of technical review, political coordination, and strategic planning. Morning meetings with state governors requesting project funding, afternoon sessions with her technical team reviewing engineering proposals, evening correspondence with international colleagues sharing innovations and coordinating global development initiatives. The California delegation is requesting a meeting about Colorado River management, Emily announced, entering with the day's prioritized correspondence. They're particularly interested in your Cascade Reservoir approach for managing seasonal water flow variations. Margaret nodded, already visualizing the engineering challenges presented by the Colorado River's massive flow variations and complex interstate politics. Schedule them for next week and ask Catherine to prepare her analysis of sediment management options that will be crucial for any large-scale river development. Thomas appeared in the doorway with maps of the Missouri River system spread across his arms. The Army Corps of Engineers wants to consult on flood control measures for the entire Mississippi watershed. They're finally acknowledging that isolated levee systems create more problems than they solve. Exactly what we predicted 5 years ago, Margaret replied with satisfaction. Systematic approaches prevent problems rather than simply redirecting them. Schedule a presentation for their senior staff. It's time they understood how network thinking could transform flood management. A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Margaret's secretary announced a visitor who made her pause in surprise. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the woman who had first recognized Margaret's intelligence and supported her fight for legal independence. "Mrs. Whitman, what brings you to Washington?" Eleanor entered with the same purposeful energy Margaret remembered from their first meeting years earlier. "I'm here representing the National Association of Women's Clubs, Margaret. We want to establish a scholarship fund supporting young women pursuing engineering education." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. "That's wonderful news. How can I help? We want to name it the Margaret Brennan Foundation for Women in Engineering. Your story has inspired thousands of young women to pursue scientific education. Despite family and social discouragement, we want to provide them with the financial support to turn inspiration into achievement." The proposal was deeply moving, her name associated with educational opportunities for future generations of women engineers. But more than personal recognition, it represented systematic change in how society viewed women's intellectual potential. "Mrs. Whitman, I'm honored beyond words, but I'd like to suggest a modification. Name it the Foundation for Engineering Innovation and make it available to any student, regardless of gender, who demonstrates exceptional talent and determination despite challenging circumstances." Eleanor smiled, spoken like the woman who's never forgotten where she came from or what barriers she's overcome. "That's exactly why you're the right person to direct this foundation's mission." That evening, Margaret and Thomas walked along the Potomac River, discussing the day's developments and planning their responses to the increasing demands for their expertise. Their conversation was interrupted by a young woman approaching hesitantly, clearly working up courage to speak. "Excuse me, Mrs. Brennan, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to thank you personally." Margaret turned with interest. "Thank me? For what?" "For proving it was possible. I'm Sarah Chen, a first-year engineering student at George Washington University. When I told my family I wanted to study engineering, they said it was impossible for a Chinese woman to succeed in such a field. Then I saw your exhibit at the Smithsonian, read about your journey from the auction block to federal department. Director, you showed me that impossible just means no one has figured out how yet." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. This was why all the struggles, all the challenges, all the battles against prejudice and assumption had been worthwhile. To create pathways for brilliant minds that might otherwise be discouraged or dismissed. "Sarah, what area of engineering interests you most?" "Structural engineering, specifically earthquake-resistant design. I want to develop buildings that can protect people during seismic events." Margaret smiled, remembering the Japanese correspondence that had started their exploration of seismic engineering challenges. "Would you be interested in a summer research position with our department? We're beginning collaborative work with Japanese engineers on earthquake-resistant infrastructure." Sarah's face lit up with joy and amazement. "Mrs. Brennan, that would be beyond my wildest dreams." "Then let's make sure your dreams keep expanding," Margaret replied, "because the world needs minds like yours, working on problems that haven't been solved yet." As they continued their evening walk, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary circle her life had traced. From the desperate woman sold at auction to the federal department director inspiring young engineers worldwide. From the burden her family couldn't afford to bear to the role model showing others what was possible when talent was recognized and nurtured. "Do you think she'll succeed?" Thomas asked, referring to Sarah Chen's ambitious goals. "Absolutely," Margaret replied without hesitation. "She has the same hunger I recognized in Emily and Catherine, the determination to prove that intelligence matters more than other people's assumptions about what you're capable of achieving." They paused at a bench overlooking the river, where lights from the city reflected in gentle ripples that seemed to carry messages of hope toward destinations unknown. Margaret leaned against Thomas's shoulder, feeling the deep contentment that came from work that mattered, love that had grown stronger through shared challenges, and the knowledge that their partnership had created something larger than either could have imagined alone. "No regrets about the path that brought us here?" Thomas asked, understanding the contemplative mood that sometimes overtook her during moments of reflection. Margaret considered the question one final time, thinking of the auction block, the legal challenges, the skepticism and prejudice they had overcome, the obstacles that had somehow become stepping stones to achievements beyond imagination. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Every struggle taught us something valuable. Every challenge forced us to become stronger and more innovative. Even the auction block, especially the auction block, because it taught me that my value isn't determined by how others choose to see me, but by what I choose to build with whatever circumstances life provides." Above them, stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, each point of light a reminder that even in darkness, brilliance could shine through to guide others toward possibilities they might never have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that innovation and partnership could transform impossibility into achievement. But tonight was perfect. Meaningful work that would outlast them both. A love that had grown from mutual respect into unshakable partnership, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had changed not just their own lives, but the world's understanding of what became possible when society finally learned to recognize and nurture human potential regardless of the circumstances in which it was found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.